If we are going to sin, we must sin quietly. Griffith Jones, Attorney General of Kenya.
Our story is of Kenya, a land of contrasts, a land of cool highlands, tropical coast, and great plains teeming with game.
During the British exploration and colonization of Kenya, they pushed the native population underfoot with institutionalized poverty and forced labor, specifically affecting the ethnic group known as the Kikuyu. Many of these Kikuyu fought for Britain in the Second World War, and the British encountered resistance from the Kikuyu, who, in exchange for these injustices, formed a revolutionary group known as the Mau Mau, who struck out in several brutal attacks beginning in 1952. In exchange for these attacks, the British declared a state of emergency that began a massive internment campaign to cure the Mau Mau of what the British believed was anti-civilized savagery. The British forced nearly the entire Kikuyu population into concentration camps across Kenya. For years, the rest of the world turned a blind eye to these camps, until a massacre at Camp Hola, killing 11 detainees, was too high profile for the British to conceal. As a result, the British shut down the camps and hid documents to save face. When Kenya gained independence, the internment was soon forgotten. As the sun began to set on the British Empire, so too did it set on the Kikuyu. It seemed as if the British were able to sin quietly after all. In 1895, the British government established the East Africa Protectorate in modern-day Kenya. They explored the area and claimed the most fertile land in the highlands. The British tricked the Kikuyu into selling their land and forced the entire native population into African reserves, inspired by America's Indian reservations.
Well, the African reserves were set up deliberately so the Africans would have some access to some land, but the best land was reserved for the settlers.
The British had molded Kenya into the white man's paradise, but while Nairobi grew into a bustling metropolis, the African reserves became increasingly cramped and dilapidated. Unrest began to grow amongst the Kikuyu, who longed for the rolling hills and fertile soil of their true home. The stage was set for catastrophe. All it needed was the catalyst. During World War II, Britain drafted around 96,000 Africans under their rule into the King's African Rifles, or KAR. These soldiers fought on many fronts, mainly Madagascar, Libya, Burma, and Ethiopia. The veterans of the KAR would later become known as Askaris. These Askaris fought under the assumption that they would be rewarded with better conditions after the war was over. When they came back home, the conditions in the reserves got worse. Feeling cheated, these Kikuyu Askaris formed a revolutionary group known as the Mau Mau. The first major death was not that of a white man, but of the government-assigned chieftain, Senior Chief Waruhiu. On October 9, 1952, Chief Waruhiu was driving into the highlands days after his inauguration. On the way to his destination, several Mau Mau fighters masquerading as policemen stopped the car, shot the chief, and retreated back into the forest. The British were horrified by this act and assigned a new colonial governor who enacted a state of emergency.
Troops are in the streets of Nairobi. Sir Evelyn Baring, the governor, salutes the men of the Lancashire Fusiliers who have flown in to help clear his colony of the Mau Mau menace, which has struck fear into Kenya's very heart.
Declaring emergency, they gave him special rights to detain people without trial, to round up people and put them in eventually detention camps.
We've got to try now, at a very early date, to repair the damages done by Mau Mau and to press ahead as hard as we possibly can with peaceful development for the future. The struggle against Mau Mau has been long. It will, I'm afraid, continue for some time longer. But let me add, we are not stationary. We are making progress in that struggle, and we are all confident that in the end we will succeed.
But mere months after, another attack came. On the night of January 26, 1953, Mau Mau fighters killed husband and wife Roger and Esme Ruck, a young couple living on a farm in the outskirts of Nairobi. After they killed the two, several African servants working for the Rucks joined the Mau Mau fighters and killed their 6-year-old son Michael in his bed. Bering declared war on the Mau Mau hiding in the jungle, dropping 50,000 tons of bombs to try to flush the insurgents out. But as attacks within Nairobi continued, the British realized that this element of the Mau Mau was not the entire movement.
The Kikuyu organized Mau Mau principally by using a unity oath, which was a special oath that was developed specifically for building connections among all Kikuyu. Ultimately, 90% of all Kikuyu, men, women, and for that matter teenagers, had taken the oath.
While outwardly, the British still painted the Mau Mau as a small terrorist group, the actual colonial response was far larger and far more terrifying than the outside world knew. Bering gathered a group of intellectuals and psychologists at his estate to attempt to understand the Mau Mau problem. This group judged that the grievances presented by the Mau Mau were not important, but rather, the Mau Mau were wrought with some sort of mental illness onset by their oaths, making them violent and insensible. The only way, these men decided, to free the Kikuyu from this madness was to force them to forsake their oaths. The government built several dozen prison camps and fenced-in villages wherein they would house the Mau Mau, creating a system called the pipeline to attempt to re-civilize the Mau Mau. The more a prisoner had forsaken the Mau Mau cause and acted in a civilized manner, the more they would be given better conditions and later be released. The British created the Cowan Plan, which allowed colonial officers to use torture, violence, and coercion to get the Mau Mau to renounce their oaths. With this system and the camps in place, Bering executed Operation Anvil, where troops flooded Nairobi's crowded streets and remote reserve villages alike. In the course of several days, hundreds of thousands of Kikuyu were moved from their homes, which were then burned down. The detainees were then sent to the Gulag camps, where they would encounter some of the most creative and sadistic methods of torture ever put to use, all commonplace and sanctioned thanks to the Cowan Plan.
I even saw a man at Compound 2, McKinnon Road, forced to drink a full bucket of water by a white man nicknamed the Whip. They beat him until he'd drunk so much water that his stomach swelled and it started coming out of his mouth, nose and ears. Eventually he died.
Did you have cause to give the order to, or yourself put your boot on their neck of these resistors, the ones that were howling?
Can we stop talking for a moment?
No, because I'd quite like you to answer that.
I will answer it when I have stopped talking for a moment. I'm sorry, but I...
Well, do you have a problem with that question?
No, it's a hypothetical question.
No, it's not. It's a very precise
You've
question.
asked me, did I put my foot on anybody's neck? No. I know where those questions are coming from.
Well, these are in the memorandum written by the Attorney General at the time to Bering.
I did not read it.
Okay, well, I have read it. And he describes you telling him that in some detail, that if they resisted, that they'd be knocked to the ground, and if they continued to resist and howl, a foot would be placed on their neck, and if they continued to resist after that...
You asked if I did it.
They'd be made to be unconscious. I asked you if you personally did it, yes.
You asked if I did it.
Yes, and you say...
And I did not.
Did you cause the order to be given? Did you give the order to do that? Are you not going to answer the question?
No, I'm looking at you with certain thoughts in my mind.
The Mau Mau were forced to work by the British in horrible conditions building the infrastructure of modern Kenya. Embakasi Airport, now named Jomo Kenyatta Airport, was built by enslaved Mau Mau convicts. Many workers died in these conditions. To save time, Their corpses were thrown into the ditches they had previously dug. There was, however, one incident that pierced the veil: the Camp Hola massacre. On April 3rd, 1959, the commandant of the camp was frustrated with the detainees refusing to work, and ordered his guards to beat any who disobeyed his orders, stirring up a riotous exchange in which guards killed 11 detainees and injured over 70 others.
Once they realized this disaster that had occurred, they attempted to cover it up. They claimed that the people who died at Hola had died from contaminated drinking water.
The British government investigated the incident. These hearings called the Cowan Plan into question. To save face, they slowly shut down the camps, hoping they would fade away from the eyes of the outside world. Meanwhile, Jomo Kenyatta worked with both natives and white settlers to gain independence. Kenyatta bridged the gap, using the phrase "forgive and forget." The natives would forgive the settlers for the oppression at their hands, and the settlers would forgive the Mau Mau. Kenyatta succeeded. On December 12, 1963, Kenya gained independence, and the British exchanged power with Kenyatta. But as fireworks erupted against a pitch sky, jubilant cries drowned out the atrocities of the British, and the natives held up their end of forgive and forget. The existence of the camps would be forgotten for nearly half a century. The silence was broken. Several Mau Mau fighters sued the British government in 2009 and won.
The British government recognizes that Kenyans were subject to torture and other forms of ill treatment at the hands of the colonial administration.
The settlement allowed the world to explore the ends to which Britain attempted to keep their global empire, the crimes they committed against the Mau Mau in exchange for the attacks, and the horrors the Kikuyu encountered in the camps. Hard as the colonial government tried, they could not, after all, sit quietly.
Kabai get the Yomeo, I want gaina, da dongalingorai. Taruga, you want a merenga, Gerico, Mirango, as you may tell, Yankenua, didn't go, Danango, Dorai.